So let's start with a few moments of silence. Closing the eyes. Starting to relax the body, the face, the shoulders. Centering ourselves in the middle of the chest. Centering ourselves in the I am feeling of me. The stillness and the joy of being radiating from the heart. So the topic today is Santosha, the second niyama. I'll start with a quote by Swami Rama. He said, "Contentment is falling in love with your life." So this niyama is usually translated as contentment. So practicing and cultivating contentment in our lives. So contentment means that no matter what life brings, we cultivate a sense of joy and gratitude. So the meaning of this word, it's coming from the Sanskrit root tush, which means pleasantness, delightment, to be pleased, to be satisfied. But also you might remember the Sanskrit word shanti. So shanti, shanti, shanti. And this word is referring to peace and contentment. And ultimately this is pointing to the peace of our being. So the pure beingness that is ourself behind the fluctuations of the mind is a sense of peace and a sense of contentment. It's actually the nature of our being. Maybe you remember at the end of a yoga class where maybe you're invited to lay in Shavasana and to start to melt in this sense of peace, and it's not something that is determined by the external circumstances, but we relax and open up and provide the space for the peace of being to start to shine through into the experience and the joy of being. So it's not just a peace like shanti, it's also a joy. Ultimately, contentment is a consequence of a life lived in naturalness, and it's an intuition of our real nature. Contentment is a harmony with ourselves. So being in a state of harmony, not caught up in the fluctuations of the mind and of course in the fluctuations of the ego, when we're resting back in the harmony and the naturalness of ourself. So of course naturalness is the opposite to struggle. So in the ego there is a tendency, its naturalness is struggle, and in the self the naturalness is harmony. A lot of the times it's considered that many sages and philosophers have said that contentment is our duty and our right as human beings. So as a human being, we have a right to be happy. In fact, it's even almost like what the laws and the society are trying to protect or trying to, they're always prioritizing. How can everyone be at peace? How can people be happy? How can people be content? So it really is a right of ours, and then also a duty to make sure that we are maintaining a sense of peacefulness and contentment. And why not? So what contentment is not? Contentment is not just affirmations and positive thinking. So it's not just a mind activity of contentment. Contentment is not a passivity. So we'll go through these in the talk today. That contentment isn't just detaching from situations and not engaging. So just because the ego's nature is struggle, that shouldn't be confused with making sure that we're doing non-activity. As we speak about spiritual bypassing, that we're not ignoring the situations of life, but somehow infusing them with gratitude, joy, happiness, and peace, no matter what the external circumstances are bringing. So it's not just a formality that, oh, I need to be happy, I need to think positively, everyone should be optimistic. But actually, there's something much deeper that we're going to be speaking about, that we're cultivating, which of course is the values of the spirit again. The niyamas are helping us to cultivate the qualities of the spirit, so that more and more and more our lives and our being becomes transparent to the qualities of the heart, which is an acceptance, a love, an allowing, and ultimately, especially highlighted by this niyama, our being is a state of peace and actually a state of joy and bliss as well. This is, of course, pointed to with the idea of equanimity. So no matter what the external circumstances are bringing, pleasure or pain, we are equanimous. So we're not craving more of the pleasure and having an aversion to more of the pain, but coming from a place inside of ourselves that is basically detached and wise. So when we have wisdom, we're connected to understanding that everything in life is impermanent. So it would be limited or almost a little bit faulty to be craving or caught in aversion over whatever life is presenting to us, because ultimately it'll pass. And the best option, of course, would be to enjoy the peace of your own being, no matter what the external circumstances are. And the more and more that we build up the equanimity and build up the happiness, we actually start to get reserves of happiness. And this is something that we need to cultivate. So we can speak about the difference between relative happiness and absolute happiness, both of which we want to cultivate. So relative happiness is the happiness that is evaluated through the mind. So the mind evaluates, oh, this is peaceful and this is beautiful and I'm so grateful based on the circumstances. The mind has evaluated, I love this, I'm grateful for this, I feel so joyful and peaceful because of this. So this is the relative happiness, and this happens, it can be a training. There's a evolution in this kind of happiness, in the relative, that more and more we cultivate in the mind positive attitudes, happiness, and contentment. And like I said, this is helping to build up reserves in happiness, reserves of happiness inside of ourselves, where we're having this tendency to be optimistic. And actually, optimism is a very powerful and very advantageous attitude for us, even just outside of the spiritual context. As human beings, to have optimism is an aliveness of our biology. It brings healing into our being, like this laughter healing methods and the Taoist technique of the inner smile, which helps to promote chi flow in the being. So having optimism, having a brightness and a happiness, even though it's relative, it's the mind that's doing it. We'll speak about what the other option is, but even though it's the mind that's cultivating joy and happiness in our being, it's building up reserves of happiness in ourselves. And it's actually like a doorway or a gateway to the ultimate happiness, the absolute happiness. And without these reserves of happiness in our being, we become high maintenance. We become pessimistic. We become a pain for ourselves and for others. So even just in a totally relative sense, to build up happiness, not an artificial happiness, but cultivating, training ourselves to feel grateful, to trust that we might not get what we want, but we get what we need, and to trust the divinity and the sacredness of life. More and more, this is cultivating a very beautiful quality. It's cultivating Santosha inside of our being. Although ultimately we don't want to be influenced by external circumstances, ultimately we don't want to have to rely on the mind for happiness, because the mind is a fluctuation of energy and matter, and it will always be affected by its environment. Although we don't want to have to rely on that external support for happiness, it's still really wise and responsible for us to take care that we are preparing the proper conditions for our spiritual practice. So just like in meditation, we're supposed to be going beyond the body. We're supposed to be going beyond the mind. Ultimately, that's the goal of our meditation, to recognize something that's formless. It doesn't mean that we sit in an uncomfortable position, or that we eat really bad food before, or we meditate in an uncomfortable environment. It's still wise to prepare the conditions. So in the same way, even though what we want to talk about in this topic of Santosha is the absolute happiness, the depth of being of what we really are, even though this ultimate nature is what we're referring to, it doesn't mean that we don't prepare the conditions and we train ourselves to have positive thoughts, to have more spaciousness. All of these are preparing the proper conditions for our spiritual practice, for our realization, for our meditation, and for our contentment. So ultimately, not the external elements should be determining the joy and how we feel, but we should still take care to prepare. So what is that absolute happiness? The absolute happiness is the reality of this reality, or the universe. The universe, one of its main qualities is ananda, or bliss. And this is where the distinction comes between a relative happiness based on what the mind has evaluated. You know what, I can feel happy now. Look how beautiful this day is, or how wonderful the stars have aligned for me today. That happiness that is on a relative level, determined by the mind and the moment in time. And the ananda, which is the Sanskrit word for pure bliss, which is not a relative happiness, but just the pure being. So what can be felt with the I am feeling. And it's the other quality of our meditation that we need to cultivate and enhance. So in our meditation, we focus on stillness. Stillness in the pauses, in the breath, stillness in this kind of resting back in the thoughtless nature of our being. So we're coming to this very quiet place where there's a stillness, and recognizing that stillness, asking, who am I? So Patanjali's perfection of Santosha, he speaks about in chapter 2, Sutra 42. He says, as a result of contentment, Santosha, bliss is achieved. So bliss or Ananda is one of the names for God in the names Sat, Chit, Ananda. So pure existence, Sat, pure consciousness, Chit, so awareness, and pure bliss. And that's because the I am feeling is bliss. It's not a pleasure that we get through the senses. It's the bliss of being. A bliss because it's the infinity. It's an absolute freedom. It's a feeling of equanimity, so a state of harmony and balance where there's no struggle. And this kind of resting and this feeling of balance and equanimity and harmony, you could even say is our purpose in this life, or you could argue it's our purpose. It's why we're here, is to have balance and harmony. And the reason would be is because that when we have a feeling of balance and harmony, we're no longer striving. So when we feel at peace, when we feel a sense of harmony, we're not striving anymore. So it's almost like the purpose has been fulfilled. But the peace is our own being. So the peace is actually where the desires and where the striving and where the life and where the energies are coming from. So they're coming from ourself. And normally we try to attain the peace or the satisfaction through objects. But actually what we need to do is turn those energies back inward, back to their source. So the very feeling of being, which comes before the actions. So of course, I am doing, I am striving, I am looking, I am achieving, I am sensing, I am thinking. The I am, the feeling of me before it gets identified with activities, is actually what we're looking for. So instead of looking for that sense of peace and satisfaction through the activity, this niyama is recommending to be rooted in the sense of peace inside of ourselves and to act from there. So it doesn't mean that we say, the peace is inside, I will not be acting anymore, because that will be denying the fact that the peace is right here. It means to be rooted in this sense of peace, but still to act. Or this is more of a tantric approach. So the opposite, a more Vedantic approach would be to say, the peace is over here and that's enough. I don't need to act. But in our lives, it seems that we are called to act. No one is running away to only be resting in their detached nature of pure self. We're actually engaging in the world. So it means that we need to, or the invitation is to feel just as much this way inward into the peace as we're acting outward into the world. So the bliss that Patanjali is referring to, he says, practicing Santosha, cultivating more happiness, more detachment, more equanimity, cultivating more contentment, more positivity, cultivating optimism in our life, the perfection that will be reached is bliss or Ananda. So of course, this is not a peak experience. It's not like, whoa, that was so blissful, it was ecstasy. It's not a peak experience of bliss, but a continuity of staying rooted in the freedom of being, a constant condition, a level of consciousness. It's a way of keeping ourselves grounded in love. So love is a synonym for pure being. It's not love for something or an outward energy, but just the being is this joy and love that we are. So it's a training that we're going through, how to open ourselves more to these qualities. Abhinavagupta says, what we call bliss is actually the illumination of our own self. And this should or can really be felt in our yoga and meditation practice, especially when the energies have started to open up a little bit and we've just done some sun salutations, and then we feel that what we call bliss is actually the illumination of our own self. So a feeling of joy, but it's radiating from our self. So our self is illuminating our experience. the self is radiating not a visual light, but just a radiance. There's an aliveness. The body and the ego construct starts to become transparent to this radiance of the self. So, to clarify, the bliss is not a hedonistic pleasure. So it's not in this realm of the relative where there's pleasure and pain, but bliss is an expression of all of the entire reality. The whole reality, because of its freedom, because of its ecstatic expression, this is the bliss that we're speaking about. And maybe you've heard about this quote, "Follow your bliss." So the full quote is, follow your bliss. If you do follow your bliss, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while waiting for you. And the life you ought to be living is the one you are living. When you can see that, you begin to meet people who are in the fields of your bliss, and they open the doors to you. I say, follow your bliss and don't be afraid. And doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be. If you follow your bliss, doors will open for you that wouldn't have opened for anyone else. So this quote that is so often stated about following your bliss, it's because it so intuitively points to something that we know and that we feel. That when we're following our aliveness, or when we're following the feeling of joy, or the feeling of ourself and our authenticity, opportunities open and we're saying yes to life. And it's like when we spoke about how the benefits of meditation, the second one where meditation gives us a better life because we're just more open. We can see opportunities because we enter situations with an open attention without already having a filter about what that situation has opportunities and limitations before coming in with those preconceived ideas. We just, when we're following our bliss, there's a curiosity and an openness. And actually, the life doesn't really change, but you change. We change. Following the freshness and the aliveness of this moment. So we can even do a little experiment where we close the eyes. Taking a moment to start to center back into this feeling of our own being, just for a moment here, noticing we are alive. And the feeling of pure life is not a closedness, but an openness and a joy. Our being is shining through as a radiance, as a light. Breathing into the heart to keep this energy open and more expressing from the center of our being. So the niyama is recommending that we cultivate happiness and contentment in the relative, so that this truthfulness and this shining of our being can more be expressed and shine through our lives that we find in these moments of meditation and stillness. So ultimately, we're cultivating a spiritual value, because this is a value of the spirit. The spirit is at peace. It's not at feeling joy because it's acquired something. It's just its very nature. The nature of eternity, it happens to be openness and peace. This is the cultivating of the opposite of the values of the ego. So the values of the ego, or of the illusory self, sense of individual self, is fear, tightness, limitation. And of course, the opposite is love, openness, and infinite possibility. Santosha is also synonymous with surrender. So this idea of surrender and the idea of contentment can have these interesting, maybe false connotations where surrender is perceived as a passivity. But surrender is pointing to the truth of our being, not an action. So, of course, the limitation of the words might imply that to practice surrender means to practice letting go of action. But actually, surrender can be performed, and it actually needs to be performed through activity. Surrender through action, which is karma yoga. So acting with a detachment and a surrender. So this is a quality of the spirit that we shine through our actions. It means we might take firm action, maybe even strong action or big efforts. But how can we do that with this continual act of openness and service, that we're allowing ourselves to be a vessel for activity to flow through, instead of clamping down with the tightness of the ego, thinking we are or we need to do this ourselves. A quote from Eckhart Tolle, he says, "Your happiness comes not from the circumstances, but from the conditioning of your mind." This is where the suffering really exists. And Nisargadatta Maharaj says, as we start to look at this idea of suffering, which of course is the opposite to santosha. Suffering is the quality of the ego, because it's inherently conditioned by suffering, because it's limited, where santosha and contentment is the quality of the spirit, because the spirit is unlimited. He says, pain is physical, suffering is mental. Beyond the mind, there is no suffering. Pain is merely a signal that the body is in danger and requires attention. Similarly, suffering warns us that the structure of memories and habits, which we call the person, is threatened by loss or change. Pain is essential for the survival of the body, but none compels you to suffer. Suffering is due entirely to clinging or resisting. It is a sign of our unwillingness to move on, to flow with life. As a sane life is free of pain, so is a saintly life free from suffering. So this is an interesting idea that pain is necessary, pain is healthy, pain is the body's attempt at informing us about what's happening in the moment. Pain is a sign of the aliveness, pain is part of nature. But suffering is coming specifically from the craving or aversion of the mind. So like Nisargadatta said, beyond the mind, there's no suffering. The suffering is that prolonged psychological discontent that is way worse than any pain that we can feel. Even pain is so often acquainted with suffering. And it's not really the pain that's the problem, but the suffering that perpetuates it. And Patanjali says, interestingly, in the Yoga Sutras, for the sage, the world is suffering. So for the sage, for someone who knows the infinite nature of being, the world is suffering. And he's not saying that the sage is unhappy, But the sage can recognize that as long as people are confused or trapped only in the relative, not touching the depth of their being, then the world is suffering. So this is something that can and should be avoided, actually, according to Patanjali. We do and we should make efforts away from the suffering. So as long as there's clinging or resisting, craving or aversion, there will be suffering. Pain is essential, and suffering is just the ego. So practicing Santosha is almost like a sublimation practice of the mind. So when we practice contentment, we transmute that suffering, the energy of the mind that normally went into suffering is transmuted into acceptance, gratitude, and wisdom, which is the sublimation. It's turning an energy that we already have into something that's more refined. And of course, this can be done with one of our favorite techniques here, which is allowing everything to be as it is. So trusting and allowing everything to be as it is, which is not something that we have to force with the mind, but it's a recognition of the truth, that the truth or the reality or Shiva, consciousness, awareness, bliss, is allowing everything to be as it is. So the more that we do that, the more that this quality of spirit can shine through our being. One of my favorite teachers, or an author that I like very much, Dr. David Hawkins, he's a more scientific approach, and he has also an interesting quote about pain and suffering. He says, "The true source of joy and happiness is the realization of one's existence in this very moment. The source of pleasure always comes from within, even though it's occasioned by some external event or acquisition. In any one instant of time, no such thing as a problem can exist. Unhappiness arises from going beyond the reality of now and creating a story out of the past or the future that, because neither exists, has no reality." So this is so interesting. Of course, he's pointing to the spiritual truth that the source of joy is ourself, although it may be occasioned by or associated with an external object. So we associate the joy to the object, but actually the joy, the source of joy, is ourself. The source of all the reality is ourself. And that he's inviting us to come closer and closer and rediscover and explore the now, which of course is the whole philosophy behind many spiritual practices, and Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now and Ram Dass's Be Here Now, that say that in this moment, in this very moment, is the completeness of the whole reality. In fact, in yoga and in, of course, the other esoteric traditions, they speak about time simply being an illusion. The mind is the follower of time. Our being is timeless. So when we find the pauses between the breath and the stillness, there's no time there. We step out of the time-bound reality into the stillness of being. So because the mind is linear, it follows a trajectory of time. But actually the moment is the reality and is absolutely timeless. Time is it's just a metric. It's illusory if we believe it to be absolute. Time is not absolute. So what is this recommendation of living in the now that all of these sages are recommending for us? Actually, living in the now is the same thing as Santosha. There are many ways that we can root ourselves into this moment, but of course the main way will be the wisdom. So the study and the exploration and the yoga of exploring what is this moment through the different techniques, like allowing everything to be as it is, where we start to acknowledge not the contents of the moment, but the moment itself. So a lot of times when we are practicing this being present, we become present to the objects of this moment. Okay, I'm here and I'm totally aware of my surroundings. This is like mindfulness, where we're mindful, very present to all the objects. But Santosha ultimately is about being present to the moment. So what is the background of all these objects at once? What is the present moment itself, rather than being present to the contents of the moment? So the moment itself is a formless space of existence that gives existence, or gives knowing, or gives room for the contents to exist, of course. In our yoga practice, we use the breath and the asanas, the joy of stretching, the interest in the moment, the senses, to root us in the present moment. And of course, we also use the self-inquiry technique. So asking, who am I? Because ultimately, what we are is the present moment. There's no way that there's this infinite present moment and then somehow there's all of these people who are outside of it. Actually, we are the content, we are a piece of the content of this moment. So my body, my thoughts, my emotions, my breath are part of the contents of this moment. But also, I am also the moment itself. Just like the moment itself is the background of all the objects, so am I one of these objects. So actually, asking who am I is pointing ourselves back right to the I feeling. So this is the self-inquiry method, which we practice a lot, which is the teaching of Ramana Maharshi, this yogi in the frame at the school and on the walls, who says that actually we need to start to become aware of the awareness itself. So another way that we can do that is asking, who am I? But another question that Rupert Spira gives us is to ask us ourselves in meditation, am I aware? So we can try that now, closing the eyes and asking ourselves the question, am I aware? And notice where the awareness goes to find the answer to that question. Am I aware? So of course the mind comes back in later to evaluate if you're aware or not. But first, when you ask the question, and just check in now if you're aware by asking, am I aware? So the awareness is revealed. And this questioning of our own awareness is one of the ways to bring us back into the present moment. So this is called self-inquiry. Instead of inquiring into the world and into the objects, to inquire into the self. Who am I? And to come resting back into our own presence. So the process of waking up is an immediate and a long-term process. So asking, who am I, immediately brings us into the moment. But we also have to make room for this evolution, which may be the bypassing type of spirituality, or also the Vedantic techniques, might not give as much emphasis to the long-term evolution that we need to more and more detach and decondition our body and mind to make room for more of this presence and realization to shine through. So doing the immediate processes of being right here, right now, and questioning, who am I and am I aware? And coming straight into the now is one way and is one process, but also practicing Santosha, practicing letting go, detachment, surrender, meditation, doing yoga to decondition the tensions and the limitations of the body. All of these are long-term processes to more and more allow this realization to shine through. Are you comfy down there, you little perch? Waking up to the present moment is an immediate and a long-term process. We can practice waking up now, but also we can decondition the tendencies of the mind, which take us away from the moment. The mind takes us away from the moment because it believes it needs to plan, evaluate, think, etc. So Eckhart Tolle says, the majority of people confuse the present moment with what occurs in it. But these are two distinct things. The present moment is more profound than what occurs in it. It is the space in which all things take place. So living in the present moment, which is practicing cultivating Santosha, doesn't mean that we're not allowed to have plans and that we're not allowed to think. So remember, it's not that the content of the moment needs to change, but the background of where we're coming from in the moment needs to change. Are we open to the mystery of the infinity of this reality as we're acting? That would be called living in the moment, or living with this awareness of the moment. So of course we want to be present with what we're doing so that we don't stub a toe, or that we're not reactive, or that we're careful with our energies and offering attentiveness and compassion. But this is all to do with the content of the moment, but can also be aware of this background of the present moment, is the distinction that Eckhart Tolle is pointing to. So it's not just about being mindful in the moment. It's about being open to this, who am I? Remembering that what we are is a depth and consciousness behind our ego and our perceptions, our mind, our thoughts. So there's a difference between having practical thoughts and having obsessive thinking, which is rooted in the craving and aversion of the ego. So we can have practical thoughts, we can plan our lives, we can evaluate, but when that planning and evaluation and thinking starts to turn into obsessions of craving or aversion, this is where we start to cultivate suffering. And when we're otherwise just cultivating practical thoughts that are more spacious and infused with trust and presence and love and openness and the perception of the mystery of ourself, then we're cultivating Santosha. There's this nice quote, meditation is the rehearsal and life is the show. So we can do this exact practice in our meditation. So sitting in meditation and practicing to be more and more spacious, that although thoughts might appear, we don't obsess over them. So thoughts might bubble up. That's the nature of the mind, to throw thoughts out there. But if we have this tendency to obsess over the thoughts, to create stories over the thoughts that are either craving thoughts or aversion thoughts, fear thoughts, then this is the cultivation of the suffering and the cultivation of the ego. And this is a conditioning. So we're actually, unfortunately, we've been conditioned to suffer. We've been conditioned to make stories. We've been conditioned to complain. And this is just fitting in with our environment. Everyone else is complaining. I remember one of the reasons that the spiritual practice was so attractive for me personally, because it was such a freedom. I actually believed in my life up until that point when I found these teachings. I actually believed that complaining and obsessing and making stories was the right thing to do. I had been conditioned. All the authority figures in my life were doing this. It's all the examples that I saw of people that I thought were successful were complaining and making stories and being trapped in a circle of craving and aversion. So it was something that my ego was conditioned to do, that I thought that this is actually the way that we were supposed to act. And then this teaching offered this kind of freedom that, no, actually just having practical thoughts, being more spacious is the point of our lives. So we can start to train ourselves to this new direction and offer ourselves a freedom from the conditioning. There's a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. He says, "More significant than any act is the power, the impetus behind it. An ocean fish may gather enough momentum to leap into the air and may even fall into a boat and bite someone. But tracing that act to its source reveals the ocean as the cause. Our thoughts leap out of God. Creation took flight from his bow. Behind every act is the beloved. He is the cause. The child blames others for their woes. No one can change the course of his arrows, but that does not mean that one should not become adept at ducking." So this is pointing to the fact that we can practice surrender and we can practice contentment and we can practice living in this moment, but it doesn't mean that we also don't cultivate practical qualities. So we accept that there are arrows, but that doesn't mean that we don't practice ducking, said this saint. And this brings us to the topic of living with an open heart. So living with an open heart is a recommendation at the school and through Hridaya Yoga as well. And it's referring to living with a openness and acceptance to what is. Again, it's not referring to a passivity. It doesn't mean that no matter what's happening, we're living with an open heart and we're allowing everything to happen to us. It means that we're not focused on the contents, but we're focused on the moment itself. So the recommendation is that we can say no to circumstances while still saying yes to life. So we can stay open, living with an open heart. So living with the intuition of the background of the present moment. So living with a feeling of, yes, this is sacred. Living with this feeling like, yes, there's a mystery here. Staying connected to the dimension of ourselves that's not just the ego is living with an open heart. But it doesn't mean that we can't be engaged or say no to a situation while still saying yes to life. So acknowledging the completeness and the harmony that life is while still acting on the relative level and maybe even saying no. So in the reality, everything is allowed to be as it is. And as a person, if we take that perspective, then we become more transparent for the reality to shine through us, which is the infinite nature of our own being starts to take place and take up occupancy inside of ourselves when we start to adopt its attitudes. So the attitude of this infinite reality is I allow everything to be as it is. Everything is allowed exactly the way it is. There's no contraction in this infinite openness and infinite possibility of the reality that we live in. There's no saying no, there's no contraction. Life on an absolute level is a very big yes. And there's this serenity prayer that maybe that you've heard. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. So serenity is this, in this case, the word that they're using for Santosha. So to be in a state of harmony and equanimity, grant me this serenity to acknowledge the things that I can't change, but still the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, that we're not, and this really is a big question on our spiritual path, is how do I act in this situation? Do I just allow it to be as it is, or do I take action? And the more that we cultivate wisdom, we start to know the difference between the two. That actually this thing does not need my personal involvement, or this thing definitely does require my personal involvement. And the most important thing, because we may make mistakes there, and that's not always the focus, is do we get that right? But being okay with whatever the outcome is our priority and our focus. And finally, a quote from Adyashanti in his book, Falling into Grace. He says, if we can let go of the way we think it should be, then life starts to reveal its magical qualities. Opening to things as they are is what it really means to be still, to be quiet, and to be in a state of meditation. When you no longer resist reality as it is, you could say that you are in a constant state of meditation. So this is the definition of meditation. And this is why meditation is the rehearsal and life is the show. But ultimately, meditation, he says you could call this a constant state of meditation if we're allowing everything to be as it is. So opening to things as they are is what it really means to be still, to be quiet, and to be in a state of meditation. So we're quiet because there's no longer that obsession of the ego layering on top of this magical moment its fears about the future and the past and the projections. So just seeing the magic of this moment. Anything can be allowed in the moment, because this is the truth of our being. This is where the truth of our being can shine through, when we're totally present.